The Quarterly, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Lesson 13, 2 Corinthians 10, Boasting in the Lord. From the outset of 2 Corinthians, it's clear that there was a distance between the Apostle Paul and the Corinthians. Not merely a geographical distance, but a theological and personal distance. The Corinthians had become enamored with the super-apostles, 2 Corinthians 11:5 and 11, whose strength lay in their mighty gifts and powerful presentation. In contrast, Paul's ministry was characterized by weakness and affliction, bearing the treasure of the gospel in jars of clay, 2 Corinthians 4:7, even though in reality he was as spiritually gifted and able to do miracles as any of them, 1 Corinthians 14:18, 2 Corinthians 11:23, 12:12. Yet God's strength was always made perfect in Paul's weakness, which was why God had left the thorn in the flesh for Paul in place. Chapter 12, verses 7 to 9. As a result, Paul could boast of his weakness and sufferings. Chapter 11, verses 23 to 30. The climax of the epistle brings to a head the conflict between Paul and the super-apostles for the hearts and minds of the Corinthians, as Paul defends not only his apostleship, but also his strategy of writing things that are hard for them to hear in his letters, while presenting a more conciliatory face when he is with the church in person, 2 Corinthians 10:1. Everything Paul does is designed to maximize the glory and grace of the gospel, which is rooted in the suffering and death of Christ, followed by his resurrection, 2 Corinthians 5:15. This same pattern is lived out in the lives of Christ's followers, especially of the true apostles, chapter 6, verse 9, chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. Therefore, all of Paul's boasting rests in the Lord and in his strength, not in any strength or giftedness of his own, chapter 10, verse 17. Paul's appeal to the Corinthians is a remarkable mix of personal authority and gospel gentleness. Paul introduces himself in the strongest terms, I myself, Paul, 2 Corinthians 10:1, as the one who is entreating them, but then adds, by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Of course, Jesus was not always gentle and meek during his earthly ministry. There were times when Jesus could be very forceful in denouncing evil and those who were taking advantage of others. Matthew 12:34, John 2:15. And that strength remains evident in Jesus' risen form. See 2 Corinthians 13:3 and 4. However, Jesus' primary mode while here among us on earth was to be meek and gentle. Matthew 11:29. And it is this to which Paul appeals, alongside his apostolic authority, to explain why he adopted different demeanors toward the Corinthians in different contexts. When he was away from them, in his letters, he was bold and direct, while when he was with them in person, he was humble and gentle, 2 Corinthians 10:1. Like Jesus, Paul could match his approach to the needs of the situation. The current situation was that Paul was not present with the Corinthians, and might therefore be expected to be bold, 2 Corinthians 10:2, as indeed he is in the following verses. Some people, perhaps the super-apostles introduced in the next chapter, have been accusing Paul of walking according to the flesh, chapter 10, verse 2. That is, not evidencing the power of the Spirit-filled heavenly life. That's not the case. Even though Paul is walking in the flesh, that is, the weakness of a human body, as we all are, Paul's approach is fundamentally spiritual. The weapons with which he fights are not earthly and unspiritual, verses 3 to 4, weapons like human ingenuity or worldly wisdom or personal charisma or attractiveness or so on. On the contrary, in spite of his personal weakness, Paul has an armory of divinely empowered weapons with which to take on not only his earthly opponents, but the strongholds, the spiritual force of evil that lie behind them. He's been equipped with the full armor of God, with which to stand firm against the plots of the evil one. See Ephesians 6, verses 12 to 20. This weaponry cannot be deployed from a position of personal strength by Paul, however. It's precisely as he suffers and is weak that God empowers him to endure and defeat those who stand against him. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10, 13, 4. The lowly Paul can destroy lofty opinions through God's power. Specifically, the battle takes place in the hearts and minds of the Corinthians. It is they who have been captured by worldly arguments and exalted opinions, and are thus walking according to the flesh. Chapter 10, verse 5. These lofty ideas stand over against the crucified, buried, and exalted Christ, who conquers through suffering. To take every thought captive to Christ, 2 Corinthians 10:5, is thus not merely to view every field of knowledge from a Christian perspective. It is to embrace a theology of the cross, a worldview that acknowledges that it is only as we are conformed to the likeness of Christ in his sufferings and his death that we can anticipate being conformed to the image of his glory. Romans 8, 22 to 30. The thoughts of the Corinthians must not only be taken captive to obey Christ, chapter 10, verse 5, as the ESV renders it, but more generally to the obedience of Christ, which is a more literal translation, as you would find in the New American Standard Bible, which includes acknowledging the necessity of Christ's perfect obedience on their behalf. Those who truly belong to Christ will reveal themselves by their submission to Paul's teaching. Those who continue to resist Paul are marking themselves out as outsiders to Christ, and therefore as subject to God's judgment. Far from Paul walking according to the flesh, it is the Corinthians who were judging according to outward appearances. 2 Corinthians 10:7. They were attracted to what they could see with their eyes, which drew them to public displays of powerful speaking and acting. When Paul talks about people claiming to be of Christ, chapter 10, verse 7, he's not talking merely about people being Christians, but rather a specific claim by them to be an apostle, somebody who speaks for Christ. See chapter 13, verse 3. Paul had every bit as good a claim to that title as they did. In fact, he had a better claim, since the confidence of his rivals to be of Christ is in themselves. See the New American Standard Version of chapter 10, verse 7. No human being can reckon himself to be an apostle. It's an office to which one is appointed by Christ. Chapter 10, verse 18. Paul was perfectly willing to defend his apostolic authority, even if it meant descending to the level of his opponents and joining them in the insanity of their boasting. 2 Corinthians 10:8. See chapter 11, verses 21 and 23. Paul had been given this authority by the Lord for the good of the Corinthians, not to tear them down in judgment, but rather to build them up. See Jeremiah 1:10. And he was confident that when all things were finally judged by God, he would not be put to shame, but would be vindicated. 2 Corinthians 10:8. Paul's opponents might make much of the supposed difference between his boldness in his letters and the apparent weakness when he appeared in their midst. But everything had been done for their good, not because of any double-mindedness in Paul. Verse 10. They would see the single-mindedness of Paul clearly when he was next present with them. Verse 11. In contrasting himself with the super-apostles, Paul has inevitably been forced to compare himself to them. Yet at a fundamental level, he denies that there is any real basis of comparison. 2 Corinthians 10:12. What matters is not how we compare against other Christians in our own evaluation, even if those other Christians are super-apostles. Verse 12. Our own judgment is of little account. What matters is God's commendation. Verse 18. And when it comes to that measure, Paul has indeed something in which to boast, insofar as he was the one who first brought the gospel to Corinth, verses 13 to 14. It was through Paul's apostolic ministry that the Corinthians came to Christ and grew in their faith, so that they are now living letters of testimony to his calling. See chapter 3, verse 3. That work was fundamentally God's work, not Paul's. So his boast remains in the Lord, verse 17, and compare with Jeremiah 9:23. However, God's work through Paul in Corinth and elsewhere throughout the region vindicates Paul's claim to apostolic calling. Paul hoped that as the Corinthians' confidence in his calling grew, not only would he have greater opportunities to build them up in their faith, but they would also assist him in his apostolic calling of bringing the gospel to new places. Verse 16. Such pioneer work was often extremely hazardous, as the book of Acts shows us. It's likely that Paul's opponents were quite content to stay comfortably in Corinth, far away from the front lines. But true apostles, like Paul, long to see the gospel preached to the ends of the earth, especially in places where it had not been preached before. See Romans 15:20. Whatever sufferings might be necessary to accomplish that work. In that way, God would be glorified as the gospel went out in power, even while those like Paul who carried the message suffered in weakness, being thereby conformed to the pattern of their Savior. Application questions. 1. Do you boast in your weaknesses and sufferings? Why or why not? 2. Are there super apostles in the contemporary church? How do they promote themselves? And how should we respond? 3. When do you need to channel the meekness and gentleness of Christ? And when do you perhaps need to be more bold and more direct? 4. How is Jesus the perfect model of what Paul is talking about? And why is that good news for us?